Imagine saving the life of a millionaire in an accident and, in return, asking for something no one else would dare. I don't want money. I want you to find my mom. What starts as a simple act of kindness transforms into an unrelenting quest for secrets, traumas, and perhaps redemption. Get ready for a story that will turn everything you know upside down. It was late afternoon, and the lights of the buildings were already beginning to compete with the natural glow of the sky. Edward, caught in a relentless rhythm of meetings and phone calls, was driving his luxurious SUV with the familiar haste of someone who believes the world waits for their decisions. He barely noticed his surroundings until, in a split second, a piercing scream cut through the air like a blade. "Look out!" The voice came from a thin girl, barefoot, running down the sidewalk, gesticulating desperately. Before he could understand, Edward glimpsed a truck speeding towards the intersection. He slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded a few yards before stopping right at the edge of the impact. Panting, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw the girl still standing there, her face marked by fatigue and dust. She looked vulnerable, but there was an intensity in her eyes, something impossible to ignore. Edward, still in shock, got out of the car to thank her. "What were you doing so close to the street? You could have been hurt." The girl shrugged with the almost supernatural calm of someone who had seen the worst of the world. "I saw you were going to die. I couldn't stand still," she replied. The contrast was striking. A man in a suit, owner of everything money could buy, and a frail child with a voice weighed down by a maturity forced by the streets. Little did they know that this moment would be the beginning of a connection that would change their lives forever. Edward looked at the girl in front of him, trying to understand how someone so small could carry such presence. His impeccable suit was crumpled after the scare, and his usually tidy hair now had a disheveled strand from the agitation. Meanwhile, the girl remained still, looking at him with a mix of calm and exhaustion, as if she had lived much more than her age should allow. "I need to thank you," he said, still confused. He rummaged through the car for something to offer, finding his Italian leather wallet. Edward pulled out a wad of cash and extended it towards the girl, thinking money would be the most obvious and quick way to repay her. To his surprise, the girl took a step back and shook her head. "I don't want your money." Her words, spoken clearly and firmly, echoed on the nearly silent street. Edward frowned. To him, money was the universal language, a solution to practically all problems. What other reason would someone have to help him? He looked back at the girl, now with growing curiosity. "Then what do you want?" Edward asked, trying to maintain his confident demeanor, even though the encounter was slowly disarming him. She stared at him for a few moments, and her expression changed, revealing a vulnerability that had been hidden until then. When she finally responded, her voice trembled slightly, but there was a firmness Edward couldn't ignore. "I want you to find my mom." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The phrase pierced Edward like a cold wind, creating a void in his chest he couldn't explain. He looked at her again, as if seeking a clue to her story in her eyes, in her posture, or even in the dust accumulated on her clothes. Nothing made sense. "Find your mum," he repeated, more as an attempt to process the information than a real question. The girl nodded. "Yes. She left 2 years ago. I don't know where she is, but someone said she went to another place to work. She never came back." Her voice faltered at the end of the sentence, but she quickly composed herself. It was obvious it was an old wound, but also one she had learned to hide. Edward felt a growing weight. He was used to dealing with problems that had quick solutions, contracts, mergers, and negotiations of millions in a few minutes. But this, there wasn't a signature or a value that could solve what she was asking. "Why me?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Why ask me this? Because I tried alone, and no one listens to me." You look like someone who can make this happen," she replied with such straightforward frankness that Edward was left speechless. It was true. He had power, influence, and resources that few people in the world had. But why should he use them to help a stranger, a girl he didn't even know? Edward looked around as if seeking an exit. The girl's gaze, however, remained fixed on his, and for some reason he felt something change. I can't turn my back," she continued, taking a step towards him. "I just want to find her. I want to know what happened." There was something deeply honest in that plea, something Edward couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long time, he felt a discomfort in his chest, something beyond responsibility. It was closer to a purpose, a chance to do something that didn't involve gains or losses. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before facing her again. "All right," he said, with a seriousness that surprised even himself. "I will help you find your mum." The girl didn't smile, but something in her face relaxed, a small sign that she believed him. "Thank you," was all she replied, but the words sounded more powerful than any contract he had ever signed. As he returned to the car, Edward realized his life had just taken an unexpected turn. It wasn't just about finding the girl's mom. It was about something much bigger that he still couldn't understand. When Edward entered his mansion that night, a strange feeling took hold of him. Despite being surrounded by the luxury and opulence he had built over the years, everything suddenly seemed empty. The main hall, with its curved marble staircase, crystal chandelier, and carefully positioned artworks, didn't offer the usual comfort. On the contrary, for the first time in a long time, he felt small in that grand space. The image of the girl was still etched in his mind. Mariana, barefoot, thin, but with surprising strength in her voice and eyes. Edward had everything within his reach: money, influence, status, and yet he felt powerless in the face of the simplicity and weight of her request. "I want you to find my mom." He walked slowly through the room, the sound of his shoes echoing on the marble floor. A cold, almost clinical environment. He passed by the bar, where expensive wine bottles were perfectly organized, and poured himself a glass of the most expensive vintage he had. He took a sip, but the liquid, which usually relaxed him, tasted bitter. Edward knew it wasn't the wine, it was him. He left the glass on the coffee table and sank into the Italian leather sofa, throwing his head back and closing his eyes. But instead of relief, the darkness brought memories. He tried to push them away, as he had done for years, but it was too late. Something in Mariana had opened a door he preferred to keep locked. Edward had been a boy of humble origins. He grew up in a neighborhood where safety was precarious and life was a constant struggle for survival. He remembered his mother, a strong yet exhausted woman who did everything to ensure he had a chance to escape that cycle. His father, an absent man lost between temporary jobs and addictions. The responsibility of keeping the house often fell on him and his mother. "Study, Edward. The world out there is cruel to those who aren't prepared," his mother said, while dividing a cheap meal, making it seem sufficient. He wondered, at that moment, if he had ever looked back and reflected on her sacrifices. The past was something he avoided revisiting. He had done everything to climb the social ladder, to build an empire that made him immune to the suffering and humiliation he had witnessed in his childhood. And indeed, he had succeeded. But at what cost? He looked at the phone on the table. There were scheduled calls with other magnates, meetings with lawyers, preparations for billion-dollar mergers. Those were the gears that made his world turn. However, that night, it seemed that none of it mattered. Mariana's request kept pulsating in his mind like a reminder. All that money, all that influence, was irrelevant to what she needed, and strangely, to what he was beginning to realize he needed too. Slowly, Edward got up and went to a room he rarely visited. It was his personal office, but not the luxurious environment where he received clients and business partners. This was a smaller, private space where he kept things that belonged to his past. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the smell of old wood and the muffled sound of his own steps. There was a chest next to a bookshelf. He hadn't opened it in years. He knelt down and lifted the lid, revealing a pile of memories, old notebooks, some yellowed photographs, and even broken toys from his childhood. Among these objects, he found something that made him stop. It was a photo of his mother holding his hand when he was about 7 years old. Both were smiling, despite being on a simple street, with worn clothes. He stared at the photo, feeling a lump in his throat that he was not used to feeling. For the first time in years, he thought about how much his mother had fought, how much she had sacrificed, and the fact that he had spent much of his life trying to erase these memories. As he held the photo, he remembered Mariana. The determination in her face was something he had seen in his own mother's eyes. The girl's courage in asking a stranger for help seemed to echo something from the past that he had ignored for too long. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type breakfast if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. That night, Edward sat in silence for hours. The city lights shone through the large panoramic window of his office, but he barely noticed them. Finally, he spoke to himself in an almost inaudible tone. I can't help her without facing what I myself avoid. By dawn, something in him had already changed. It wasn't just Mariana who needed answers. She had made him realize that his life, as successful as it seemed, lacked something essential: empathy, purpose, humanity. This journey, which had begun as a simple request for help, was already becoming something much bigger. When the sun barely began to illuminate the city's streets, Edward was already up. He had spent the night turning over his mind, planning how to fulfill the promise he had made to Mariana. Finding her mother, Clara, seemed like a monumental task, especially for someone like him, whose life until then had consisted of delegating problems and obtaining quick solutions. But something about this promise forced him to get involved. He decided to start at the most logical point: the streets where Mariana had lived the last few years. He found her in the same corner where it all had started, under the shadow of a closed newsstand. Mariana was there, hands stuffed into the pockets of her worn-out jacket, watching the flow of people passing by with the confidence of someone who knew every corner of that territory. Seeing Edward, her expression remained unchanged, but there was a glint of expectation in her eyes. "Ready to walk, Edward?" she asked, as if challenging him. Edward, wearing ordinary jeans and a discreet jacket, carefully chosen not to stand out too much, nodded. He still felt as if that world was an unknown territory, but for Mariana, it was the only reality she knew. The first destination was the square where Clara had worked before she disappeared. "She washed clothes for some families around here," Mariana explained, as they walked among street vendors, running children, and adults sitting on improvised benches. The square's ground was worn, with cracks that seemed to reflect the untold stories of the people passing by. Mariana carried a small portrait in her hands. Edward observed the image. Clara was a young woman with tired features, but a gentle smile. The photo was faded, but clear enough to show the sparkle in her eyes. Something Edward was beginning to recognize in Mariana too. "Who do you want to approach first?" Edward asked, a bit nervous amid the hustle and bustle around them. "The workers," Mariana replied without hesitation. "They always know things. My mother talked to everyone." They went to a group of waste collectors organizing recycling carts near a graffiti-covered wall. Mariana took the lead, with the same confidence of someone used to defending her existence in a world that barely noticed her. "Does anyone here remember Clara, the laundress?" she asked, holding up the photo. One of the men, with a sunburnt face and calloused hands, looked up and frowned at the photograph. "Clara? Yeah, I remember her," he said, scratching his stubble. "She was a hard-working woman, always came here to rest after washing clothes in the alley by the old store. But I haven't seen her in a long time. 2 years, maybe. Did she say anything about leaving?" Mariana asked, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. The man shrugged. She was quiet, but sometimes she seemed worried, you know? Always looking over her shoulder as if someone was following her. You know how it is. Around here, if you attract the wrong attention, things get complicated. Edward, who had listened to the conversation in silence until then, intervened. What kind of wrong attention? What does that mean? The man hesitated, looking at Edward with distrust. People like Edward rarely appeared there, and when they did, it was usually not for good reasons. But seeing Mariana's presence, he answered, though cautiously, "You know, the debt collectors. People who take advantage of others' struggles. Sometimes people take loans, and when they can't repay, well, they disappear." The weight of that word, disappear, made the air seem heavier. Mariana looked at Edward but said nothing. There was a silent plea in her eyes, and Edward felt the weight of it on his shoulders. Determined to explore every lead, Edward and Mariana continued through the square, talking to more people. Each story revealed a fragment of Clara's life. Some remembered her as a cheerful woman, always offering help despite having little to give. Others spoke of her silence, as if she carried an invisible burden that prevented her from opening up completely. By late afternoon, Mariana suggested they go to a nearby shelter where Clara used to spend nights. The place was small and overcrowded, with mattresses spread on the floor and children playing with makeshift toys. An elderly woman greeted them with a tired but friendly smile. "Clara," said Mrs. Marta, the shelter's manager, as Mariana showed the portrait. "Yes, I remember her. She stayed here with her girl whenever she needed. She was hard-working, a good woman, but she was very scared the last times I saw her." Edward leaned forward, intrigued. Scared of what? Did she mention anything? Mrs. Marta looked at him, assessing his sincerity before answering. She said she owed money to dangerous people, that she accepted help from someone who promised to lift her out of poverty, but everything only got worse. One day she simply didn't come back. It was as if she had vanished. I felt very sorry for the girl. Mariana took a deep breath, trying to process this. Edward, meanwhile, felt as if he was beginning to uncover a story much bigger than he had imagined. Clara hadn't just run away. She had been forced to leave. But to where? And why? Before they left, Mrs. Marta touched Mariana's arm and said, "Your mother loved you more than anything. Her fear was never for herself, but for you." As they walked back through the square, the sun began to set, and the shadows of the trees lengthened over the cobblestones. Mariana held the photo of her mother even tighter. Edward, by her side, knew that this search would not be quick or easy. He began to understand that Clara was not just another victim of poverty. There was something darker involved in her story. But Edward was certain of one thing. He would not give up. He looked at Mariana, with her silent determination and impressive strength, and felt that this commitment was no longer just a promise to her. It was a step towards the humanity he thought he had left behind. Edward knew that discovering Clara's whereabouts would not be an easy mission. After the vague clues he and Mariana had found in the streets, he began to realize that his search was more complex than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a challenge of finding a missing woman, but the issue had roots that pulled him directly to his own past, a part of his life he had tried to flee from, distance himself for years. He was in the city of Chicago, a place full of contrasts. Tall skyscrapers, alongside neighborhoods that, at every corner, seemed to reflect the immense inequality of a city that breathed at a frantic pace. However, at that moment, Edward found himself in his office, in a glass building in the financial district, analyzing a pile of documents. He had planned his life strategically, solid businesses, considerable fortune, a carefully cultivated network of contacts. But the more he looked at the papers in front of him, the more he felt a difficult-to-ignore emptiness. It was as if each closed contract and each new venture were erasing some part of his being that he avoided. Mariana had somehow, with her scream, rescued something he hid even from himself. Clara's portrait, which Mariana now carried with her in a faded and crumpled photo, was there on the table, among the papers and reports. The woman in the photo smiled, but something didn't match. Something in that smile seemed sad, as if she had lived with a heavy burden. Edward fixed his gaze on the photo for long minutes, his mind drifting into speculations. It was then that he decided he needed to find answers. He opened an old file on his computer, a folder he tried to keep distant. It had been 10 years since he worked with those people, in that world, with the businesses that had led him to where he was now. But the threads connecting his present to the past began to emerge, as if some ghost were calling him back to the reality he had tried to bury. He searched through documents, old contracts, all linked to his name and his father's company, and then found something. His gaze fixed on a document dated from an acquisition negotiation, a document old, but not old enough to forget the intersections he tried to leave in the past. Clara Thompson, the name was there, and it wasn't just another generic name in a banal contract. It was more than that. It was the name of a mysterious woman he had dealt with years ago, during those turbulent business days when he was starting to become a respected name in Chicago's real estate industry. That deal with Clara, although unsuccessful, was shrouded in a halo of muted, dark memory. Edward never expected to cross paths with her again. However, it was when he looked at another file of an associate from that time that the fog in his mind finally began to clear. Richard Ramirez, the name jumped off the file, accompanied by a trail of unfinished deals and suspicious contracts. Edward recalled Richard with a familiar discomfort. He was his former business partner, always involved in dubious transactions, often dealing with problematic properties and shady deals that Edward had chosen to ignore. As much as he tried to avoid it, he couldn't deny his trajectory was intrinsically linked to this man. And as he began to understand, it was also linked to Clara's story. Edward leaned back in his chair, the weight of what he was discovering threatening to crush him. Clara was not just a missing woman trying to escape her own demons. She was part of a darker chapter of his history, a chapter he would have preferred to leave in the shadows. The scandal in which he had been involved, although apparently closed, contained the path to where Clara had been taken, but he had never allowed himself to look beneath the surface, until now. Without wasting time, Edward went after other documents, contacting old colleagues and memories of the past. He came across an old bankruptcy license, issued for one of the properties in downtown Chicago. The area, near South Loop, was bankrupt, but it was a small side note that unsettled him. Disappearance of a business partner, motivated by severe financial pressures. He didn't want to believe it. Clara Thompson had been part of this collapse, and perhaps, without even knowing it, he had closed his eyes to his own mistakes at the time. It was only by tracing the steps of this connection that he realized how deep the roots of the case were. Clara was not the only victim. It was hard not to notice that as the story unfolded, he was, in a way, connected to it all. Richard, who had been the true archetype of the story's antagonist, had manipulated situations to force project bankruptcies, extorting money and taking away even dignity. Clara paid the highest price, having her life shattered into pieces that, until then, he had refused to see. It was a piece that didn't fit into the puzzle of his life. He had played an important, albeit distorted, role in Clara's suffering. It was then, when talking to one of his old accountants, that Edward obtained the final revelation necessary to understand the magnitude of the network of lies and manipulations involving that old business cycle. The accountant revealed that Clara was more than an involuntary ally. She was a key to uncovering a dangerous game where Richard played with the lives of innocent people. As the truth began to unfold before him, Edward felt an intense need to act. Clara was not just lost in his memories or in that photo that Mariana held so dearly. Clara was somehow entangled in the transgressions of a past, and now he needed to face not only his own legacy, but also the consequences of his choices. As he prepared to seek a meeting with Richard, Edward knew he was about to enter a battle that wouldn't be resolved with quick signatures or cold transactions. It was an emotional, psychological, and moral battlefield, and he would have to face this monster from which he had fled for so long. He was getting too close to a reality he thought was a distant episode of his life. But the questions were more uncomfortable than he could ever imagine. What was the real price he would have to pay for all this? Richard Ramos had always known somehow how to play the game of life. Not the trivial game of cold market transactions and negotiations, but the more complex and invisible one. That of emotional manipulation and the exploitation of others' vulnerabilities. He didn't care about appearing in major newspaper headlines, nor being recognized at charity events. His true mastery was in a quieter, less visible art, where the pieces of a strategic board were moved in such a way that others didn't even notice. This was exactly what made him so dangerous. In the early days of their collaboration, what seemed like a friendship based on mutual growth soon turned into a dynamic of subtle control. Richard, at first glance, appeared to be the entrepreneur who had learned to dodge the tedious routine of big magnates. But what no one knew was that he had a dark side, a master at seeing weaknesses where others only saw strength. Observing Edward, this young businessman eager for quick results and great achievements, Richard knew exactly what to do to take advantage of him. With his charismatic manner and precise knowledge of how to operate within the system, he was the central piece in the transactions that made Edward reach new heights, leaving the pitfalls and dubious deals out of sight of decision-makers. But there was a price for success, and that price could only be paid at the expense of others. Clara Thompson was, for some reason, one of the victims of this manipulation. Clara didn't know how much she was part of Richard's game. She didn't know that, even being an essential figure in some backstage negotiations, she was being placed as a sacrificial piece. When she disappeared, Richard's figure almost disappeared with her. His ability to stay out of the spotlight was on full display. But Edward, in searching for Clara's disappearance, soon realized he needed to face the biggest enigma of his life. Richard, not just for how he manipulated people, but for the deep marks he left in every aspect of his relationship. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type love if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. The key to discovering the truth lay, in part, in understanding the power Richard had exercised in his choices. Something Edward would realize with horror he hadn't noticed throughout his entire journey to that point. Richard knew how to manipulate people finely and meticulously, creating invisible ties around his victims, disguised as friendship and opportunity, but which trapped everyone in a vicious cycle of mutual dependence. He never let anyone be more important than him in a negotiation, never allowed any other interest to interfere with his long-term plans. He turned everything, even relationships and vulnerabilities, into pure commodity for profit, and always escaped unscathed. When Edward realized that the solution to his search for Clara would force him to face Richard again, his mind entered a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Richard was not just a rival. He was another shadow of the past that Edward tried to leave behind, but knew he couldn't. The man with whom he had once shared laughter at pompous parties and corporate success stories had become the living representation of everything Edward feared most: fraud, the game, and the loss of true connections. Deciding to go after Richard on his own turf, an immense mansion located in the most elite areas of Chicago, a place far removed from Mariana's street life and difficult childhood, Edward felt his stomach tighten. He knew he couldn't underestimate the one who, more than once, had escaped judgment and the law. Richard was in his own orbit, out of reach, even in the field where Edward, a successful man, considered himself invincible. The mansion was everything one would expect from someone who had shaped his own future in his way. Tall, sinister iron gates, surrounded by a vast, well-guarded property, gave a sense of absolute isolation, a strong sense of privacy and security built over years of manipulation. Inside, everything was modern, but had a cold soul, an inhuman solemnity that only fed the feeling that things there were not what they seemed. Richard had a rare talent, creating an environment where he was always in control, just apparent, but so fundamental that even the most powerful felt small and insecure. Sometimes, Edward felt he was dealing with an enchanted snake that only he couldn't unravel. But there, inside that cold space, detached from the outside world, he had no escape. Not with Richard there. The man's reception was unexpectedly cordial, as if no years had passed since they last saw each other. Richard's broad smile was exactly the same as when they had exchanged business ideas, shared projects, and praised each other for the right strategy. However, Edward was not there for negotiations. His words were direct, without embellishments. "Richard, where is Clara? What do you have to do with this?" Richard's smile remained unshakable. He looked at Edward as if he were a puzzle only he could solve. "Edward, my dear, you still don't get it, do you? We all have secrets. I'm just good at keeping mine. As for Clara, I can give some clues. But remember, what you see on the surface is just a polished version of the facts. I'm not the one hiding the answers. You just need to stop looking the wrong way." The phrase, spoken with peculiar calm, insinuated that he had control, but Edward was no longer willing to enter the mind games that Richard so loved. As the conversation progressed, Edward noticed something even more unsettling. Richard didn't care. Nothing Edward said disturbed that armor of confidence he displayed so skillfully. Instead, Edward felt he was becoming a pawn in Richard's game, trying to find some trace of truth without realizing that the path had already been set before him. Each evasive answer from Richard seemed to strip away a piece of the truth he was seeking. Finally, by bringing up the old property transactions and Clara's involvement, from which he had blindly benefited, Edward saw that Richard could no longer keep his smile. For the first time, something in his eyes wavered, but it was quick, a subtle exchange that revealed more than a simple slip. Edward had taken the first step toward an uncomfortable revelation. It wouldn't be easy to confront the ghosts of the past, but he knew that, for the first time, he was stepping into Richard's shadows, not as an accomplice, but as someone determined to expose the truth. Now, Edward was no longer looking for simple answers. He was about to do something few in his position would ever be capable of: challenge Richard and expose the empire of manipulation he had so meticulously built over the years. For that, he would need courage and a dose of honesty with himself that he had avoided for years. But the battle was just beginning. It was a cold morning in Chicago, and the first rays of the sun were still swallowed by the thick layer of grey clouds that covered the city's horizon. The streets were a tangle of shadows and light, reflecting the contrast between the opulence of the skyscrapers and the darker corners, where poverty took over the concrete sidewalks. Edward walked decisively through the large meeting room of his building, one of the tallest constructions in downtown Chicago. The place where, until yesterday, he had immersed his entire being in contracts, mergers, and strategic deals, now absorbed his attention in a very different way. Clara Thompson was the key to everything. Her disappearance and the reason involving the distant past had trapped him inescapably. With his eyes fixed on his desk, where the mountains of papers seemed to gradually scratch under the pressure of his restless hands, he let out a sigh. Next to him was Anna, his assistant, and to his surprise, now someone crucial in this hunt that went beyond invoices and financial reports. She could feel his apprehension, and although it was not the time to show weakness, Anna knew how much this case was gnawing at Edward. "Do we know anything new, Anna?" Edward asked without taking his eyes off the computer screen. He knew the clues were scarce, and every second was precious in the mission to find Clara. But at the same time, he already felt as if he was sinking deeper into a sea of ignorance. The more he dug, the deeper the hole he was getting into seemed to be. Anna hesitated for a moment. They were close, very close to discovering something serious, but she didn't want to raise false expectations. She looked at him. Her eyes seemed to reflect an internal struggle. "Edward, we found a record indicating that Clara went to a clinic near her old home on Wabash Avenue. We made contact, and apparently she was there recently. With every word Anna spoke, Edward felt his body tense. That might be the clue that could finally bring the much-needed revelation. The feeling of having waited too long and discovered nothing was beginning to settle in his mind. Now, with the city's map engraved in his head, he knew that something significant was about to emerge from the search, like a detail that revealed more than mere coincidences. "We're going there right now." His voice accepted no resistance. The clear tone of command allowed no room for other plans. The clinic was in an old part of Chicago, hidden among neighborhoods that, despite their historic shops, had been neglected by the new real estate developments shaping the city. On the small street of Wabash Avenue, where the passage of years had left its mark of wear on shopfronts and buildings, the clinic stood out not just for its simplicity, but for its aura of secrecy. The place Edward had never imagined seeking now became his last resort. He needed answers. This was the last piece missing from the puzzle. Upon arriving at the clinic, the first two sensations that hit him were contrasting. A sense of apprehension due to the scant information, and a slight expectation that gave him a false sense of control. The rigid-faced receptionist didn't seem surprised to see them there. She was already expecting visits like that. At least, that's what Edward deduced from her alert posture, almost as if she was expecting someone else to arrive at any moment. "Yes, what can I do for you?" The woman's voice was tuned to a protocol tone. But Edward, as always, didn't beat around the bush. "We're looking for information about the patient Clara Thompson. We were given the suggestion that she was here in recent weeks," Edward replied with the same firm yet respectful look. He knew that the strength wasn't in shouting at them, but in the intensity that emanated from his presence. The receptionist hesitated, and for a brief moment seemed attentive to something beyond courtesy. "Dr. Keenan will be better positioned to help if you really need answers." The two exchanged a quick glance. Anna knew this could be a game, but it was also the best opportunity they would have. Shortly after, they were escorted to a discreet door at the end of the corridor. Dr. Keenan's office was immersed in profound silence, the only illumination being the soft, natural light escaping through a high window. The woman who received them wasn't interested in making any kind of charm to welcome them. Her hardened demeanor and sober behavior spoke for themselves. For someone dealing with such delicate types of patients, she maintained an observant posture that could disarm anyone. She seemed to understand that they already knew enough. "Should I assume you know about Clara's past and what she was looking for here?" Dr. Keenan shot, adjusting her glasses firmly. "The question is, what exactly are you willing to face to find out the rest? Clara's story is not just about emotional recovery, it also involves deeper dangers." Anna, more attentive, was direct. "Yes, we know what it's about. However, we need you to tell us exactly what role the clinic had in this disappearance. Where was Clara, and why did she leave like that, without a trace?" Dr. Keenan looked out the window, a reflection passing through her gaze. There was something intriguing in her behavior, almost as if Dr. Keenan had witnessed the development of this drama long before Edward and Anna were involved. She continued, "Clara came here with a need greater than just treatment. It was more of a quest to understand a secret from the past, something linked to her daughter, Mariana. What she wanted to discover may be connected to a network of contacts, those who were part of the inner circle of a man named Richard Ramos." Dr. Keenan paused for a long time, observing the impact of her words on Edward and Anna's faces. Richard had a dangerous connection to the Thompson family, and Clara was desperately trying to understand what that meant for Mariana. That's when her story got too complicated. Dr. Keenan's words left them both in shock. Edward knew who she was talking about. Richard Ramos. The name was related to him in a way he didn't expect to resurface. Each move now seemed riskier, more immersed in something deep and perverse. Clara hadn't just distanced herself from her life for painful reasons, but the secret links between her family and Richard were already revealing unthinkable connections. With each passing second, Edward felt the weight of the truth approaching. Clara, Mariana, and even Richard were part of something he had neglected but could no longer ignore. He knew at that moment there was no turning back. The clinic corridor was too quiet for Edward. The sound of his steps, muffled by the thick carpet, dragged like a burden as he tried to assimilate the storm of thoughts beginning to form in his mind. He looked once more at the photo he held with trembling hands. The image was worn, but the details were clear enough to cut through any curtain of confusion that might try to obscure his vision. Clara, still young, was beside Richard, her face covered by a gentle smile. But what really made Edward stop to look again was the familiar figure in the background. At that moment, something he refused to admit began to emerge like a shadow chasing him. He recognized the place, the party. It was an exclusive event he and Richard had attended over 20 years ago at a luxurious hotel by Lake Michigan. Edward was only 22 at the time, and his life, already marked by the pressure of being the heir to a real estate empire, was far from peaceful. But what he remembered well was not just Clara there, but also another face, his own. Edward had been at that party, at that same hotel. "It can't be," he murmured, almost in a whisper, more to himself than to Anna, who remained by his side with her eyes fixed on a file in her hands. She looked at him curiously, perhaps expecting more concrete confirmation of her own theories. Anna knew how much this was costing Edward. For weeks, he had tried to keep his successful life separate from any reference to his past, but the truth began to infiltrate relentlessly. "Yes, Anna. That photo was taken at the event where I was there, with Richard," Edward finally confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of realization. Both fell silent, staring at the photograph as if trying to uncover a hidden truth. Slowly, Edward began recalling those times. He saw himself as a conqueror, engrossed in deals and parties, completely disconnected from those around him. He unknowingly believed that was a normal life, as his youth had been built within a bubble of success and privilege. Richard Ramos, the man who had now become a more threatening shadow than any business rival, was in that environment for reasons Edward could never have understood at the time. In truth, the connections between them at that event were not as superficial as he had imagined. On the contrary, Edward was only beginning to realize now how deep and implicative their relationship was. "Here's the dilemma," Anna spoke with an unusual gravity. "If Clara and Richard really knew each other from that time, and you were so involved in that circle, how did this never come to your attention? How has all this stayed hidden for so many years?" Edward took a deep breath, Anna's question striking a chord within him. How had he not noticed before? And more importantly, why had he allowed his life to continue as if nothing had changed, while this entire story unfolded in the background? It felt as if a heavy veil was slowly being lifted, revealing a dark scenario he was only beginning to comprehend. It was at this moment that the weight of responsibility hit him hard. The implications of everything he was starting to discover were terrifying. Mariana, the girl he would save, was the missing link between him and Clara. And the truth about their connection seemed much more complex than he had ever wished. There it was, before his eyes. Clara and Richard had always been part of his world, just as much as he was part of theirs, without him ever knowing. He wanted to close his eyes, wanted to believe fate had taken a twisted turn. But the pieces were falling into place, forcing him to accept the impact of his discoveries. "Eduardo?" Anna hesitated, looking at the documents before her, as if the numbers and addresses there meant nothing compared to the emotional weight of the situation. Maybe this was orchestrated from the start, not just to protect Mariana, but perhaps to cover something Clara tried to keep secret for years. Richard is involved somehow, and Clara, despite her disappearance, certainly had a reason. Edward's eyes were tired now, but he couldn't stop seeing the scene in his mind, every detail of Clara beside Richard merging with his vision of a distant era. He had always known his success had built a wall between him and other people, but never imagined that isolation had left so much space for personal intrigues. Clara, with all her emotional scars, had lost control of a story that now seemed intertwined in unimaginable ways with his own journey. The hints could no longer be ignored. What he had thought to be just a fleeting doubt was becoming a series of increasingly blatant revelations. And the most painful truth he was beginning to understand was that he wasn't there just to find out where Clara was, but to face the consequences of his own negligence. When we went to that event, Anna continued, you weren't just friends and acquaintances. The images don't lie. Edward stared at the photo, now filled with relevance and desperation, trying to see what had escaped his field of vision. What was Clara trying to protect? From whom? Suddenly, Edward stood up and grabbed another photo. This one no longer directly relevant to the event, but something in Clara's expression in that photo seemed to embed a truth he hadn't seen before. The photo was out of place, but it could be the clue they needed. Clara knew more than he had imagined. I need to go to her, Edward said, his decision taking shape more firmly and intensely than he desired. It was time to find Clara, to finally understand the limits of her involvement with Richard and confront her with the questions that had remained secret for so long. You know it might not be what you expect, right? Anna questioned, knowing Edward was preparing for yet another emotional challenge. I'm ready for anything, Anna, he replied, and the ice forming in his heart felt more bitter and necessary than ever. Clara was alone in the small living room. Just a table, some old chairs and curtains that let through a bit of Chicago's grey light, where winter froze any sign of warmth. Nothing seemed to belong to her, or perhaps everything had become irrelevant. Her eyes were distant, fixed on a random point, as if seeking answers to questions life posed, but she wasn't yet ready to understand. When Edward entered the door, his steps echoed through the prevailing silence. The tension in the air was almost palpable, laden with weeks of uncertainties, attempts to resolve the past, and seek explanations for what Clara had done, or rather, what she had left undone. The last time they met, the situation seemed simpler, cleaner, a reunion from times when the world seemed to have fewer errors to correct. But now, faced with everything, they both knew no explanation would be simple. He saw her for the first time after so many years, and couldn't help but notice how she had changed. Clara was no longer the vibrant woman full of dreams he had known. She looked aged, her face marked by years of difficult choices and painful omissions. A mix of unresolved anger, love, and an urgent need for answers showed in their eyes. Clara, in turn, just observed him with a desperate calm. "Took you long enough to show up," she said, her tone dry, as if the words weighed more than any friendly greeting they could have exchanged. There was no cordiality in her gestures, only a weariness Edward might not fully comprehend. "I always knew you'd come after me eventually, but I don't know if it's worth it. What do you really want from me?" Edward, in a mix of confusion and anguish, forced a smile. "What happened to you, Clara? To me? To our life? None of this makes any sense." Clara observed him more intently. She seemed not to recognize the anger he carried, or perhaps had learned to ignore it, as she had done with so many other things over the years. But she knew deep down that their truth was hidden between what he didn't yet know and the lies she needed to leave behind. "Edward, you want answers? Do you think finding a justification will change everything?" She took a deep breath, as if trying to face something immense. Life is not about finding culprits. If it were, maybe we'd never be able to move forward. I made decisions for myself. Maybe a mistake here and there, but decisions you, with all your success, never had to make. I put myself in a place of abandonment and anguish because I didn't know what else to do, but you were busy with your life, your businesses, your commitments. You didn't see anything happening around us. "I couldn't know, Clara." Edward didn't want to seem insensitive, but the pain growing inside him was making everything harder. "I looked for you. I looked for you and Mariana. What were you thinking, disappearing like that?" Clara took a step back, her eyes still fixed on Edward. But now there was something new in them. It wasn't sadness or rancor anymore. It was resignation, as if she had already made the choice to say as little as possible. I was trying to protect myself, and with that, I was also trying to protect Mariana. The answer left Edward in silence, an uncomfortable space stretching between them. Protecting her. What did that mean? The anger gave way to fatigue, to the desire to understand what she meant. He tried to force a nervous smile but couldn't. Protect? From me? I was trying to do the right thing, Clara. I don't understand. All of this, I don't understand. Clara finally approached the window, her shoulders slumped, while the world outside continued its indifferent hustle. The streets of Chicago were empty, a reflection of the harsh winter, of what she felt inside. The world seems simpler when you're not the central piece, doesn't it, Edward? We always think we control everything, our life, our success, our feelings. But I took a path far from all that, and the truth about what happened to our daughter, about my disappearance, you're not ready to hear. Edward felt a sudden pain in his chest. He felt that with every word, something else was breaking inside him, something connected to his heart, a remote hope of understanding everything that had happened. "And what is it, Clara, that I'm not ready to hear?" he asked. His voice choked. He wanted her to say everything because there were no more mysteries at that moment. He just wanted an explanation. Edward looked at Clara with a deep gaze, as if he were peering through all the time that separated them. She seemed to carry within her the burden of years he would never fully understand. "Because you never knew who I really am, Edward. You never understood Clara before my disappearance. Never understood what I had to face to become who I am today. I stopped being a reflection of your life to become something that needed protection. What you see, what you want me to do, won't be enough to give you answers. It's no longer about you. It's about Mariana and how our entire past was lived for her. And you, Edward, you are the final piece of this puzzle." The sound of Clara's words resonated in the room quietly, as if Edward needed time to absorb each phrase, to make sense of what was being said. Mariana. Now he knew something was even more intertwined with his own story than he had imagined. "I don't know what to do anymore," Edward muttered to himself. He tried to process the true reason behind those words, but couldn't. Nothing seemed as clear as he wished. Clara closed her eyes and with one last deep breath said, "You still need to discover everything, Edward. We need to go beyond questions and answers. Because Mariana will show you everything you need to understand." The answer was almost as ambiguous as the silence that followed. The void between them was palpable, but something new and intriguing was emerging. The journey of discovery, which had begun with a simple search for answers, was finally leading Edward to confront the greatest reality: his own disconnection, his own wrong choices, and, more importantly, the void between him and Clara. But above all, it was the beginning of an understanding he never imagined he would feel. And then, amidst the shadows of the room and the echoes of Chicago in the background, Edward knew the game of truth was just beginning, and Mariana, more than anyone, held the keys to everything. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type "juice" if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. The moment Edward had been waiting for but dreading had arrived. The meeting with Richard would not be a simple conversation of reconciliation or even a negotiation. No, for Edward, it was more of a confrontation. Richard was not just an old friend, lost in the ambition and manipulations of the past. He represented a key to all the unanswered questions, a truth hidden in the shadows of Edward's own actions, mistakes, and decisions. Now, at the most crucial moment of his life, Edward knew he would have to face what he had avoided for so long, the consequences of his own mistakes, so well masked by decades of financial and social success. Richard was waiting for him, like a conductor waiting for the final note of a symphony. In the elegant office in the heart of Chicago, Edward felt like a stranger in a place that had never belonged to him, despite immersing himself in the luxuries and surroundings of this world of money and appearances. The place was modern and impersonal, with dark furniture and low lighting, in stark contrast to his memories of simpler moments from his hometown. But in that room, everything seemed to be aligning, the debris of the past assembling before him, awaiting his reaction. "Welcome, Edward." Richard's voice sounded grave and controlled, as always. "I thought it would take you longer to take this step. I knew this day would come, but I was so eager for you not to make this decision." Richard rose from his chair, but not to greet him. He simply looked at him with those penetrating blue eyes, which seemed to see beyond what others could, as if he knew more about Edward than Edward knew about himself. Richard had this unsettling ability to perceive people's flaws, their insecurities and frustrations in a cold and almost Machiavellian way. For years, this dark side of Richard seemed just another facet of a world distant from Edward. But now, with the lies unraveling before him, Edward didn't know if he could believe what was happening around him. "I didn't come here to waste time, Richard," Edward said firmly, trying to maintain composure. His heart was pounding, memories of the past weeks searching for Clara. The scattered clues around the city like breadcrumbs were all coming to an end. He knew an answer was about to be given. But would it be the right answer? The questions about Clara and Mariana were connected to the past. But not only that. Now it seemed that he needed to take control of his own story, to finally understand his role in Clara's choices and the impact of their relationship over the years. "The control of this situation is in our hands, Edward. I always said you weren't made for this kind of confrontation." Richard smiled as he spoke, as if simply holding the knowledge was a triumph. But Edward, finally, had had enough. "You're right," Edward replied without hesitation. "I'm not here to confront you. I'm here to end the games. It's very simple, Richard. You've been playing me all along, but I'm not the same anymore." Richard laughed, a low, almost dark laugh. "You think you can now play the same game as me, after so much discomfort in distancing yourself from the truth? Did you think you'd hide everything behind those layers of gold you called security?" Richard's words cut through the air like a sharp blade. There was something contained in them, a truth Edward had avoided perceiving. He understood that everything that was part of his successful life, the chic house in downtown Chicago, the status among millionaires, had been built on a foundation of lies and omissions. "And we both know what happened between Clara and me, and you," Edward said, trying to follow the logical course of events, piecing them together one by one. "What do you really want, Richard? Because I've seen enough." Richard maintained his gaze, his fingers drumming on the table, and his eyes gleamed with a grim smile. "It doesn't matter what you think you know now, Edward. You know what needs to be said, what needs to be done. But maybe you haven't yet fully grasped the gravity of your ignorance." He advanced towards Edward, stopping very close, the shadow of his face more pronounced as his shoulders tensed. "Clara was never yours to give, never was. You always knew she distanced herself because she knew more than you were willing to understand. And Mariana, she's at the center of it all." Edward forced himself to ignore the lump in his throat. He finally realized he was no longer adrift. He was not just a victim of Richard's game, or his own unconscious choices. He was at the epicenter of the truth, ready to finish unraveling that skein of history with his own hands. "I don't know exactly what's happening, Richard, but I can tell you that no one will be manipulated anymore. The truth will come out now, no matter the cost." His tone was direct and firm. "This network of secrets you seem to have always controlled is about to unravel." Richard looked at him with a cold stare. He seemed to know that Edward was approaching closer than he'd like to believe. He had played the cards strategically until that point, but the tide was no longer his. "The game is over for you, Richard." Edward's words sounded like a definitive sentence, He already knew there was no point in waiting any longer. The clues, the lies, the half-truths about Clara and Mariana were fitting together one by one. Richard shook his head slowly. "Deep down, Edward, you always knew how fragile these stories can be, right?" Richard responded coldly, retreating from the confrontation. "But I'll give you a piece of advice. Take good care of the promises you make, because sometimes they are more dangerous than all the enemies." Edward stayed there for a few moments. He knew that was the last time he would hear Richard's words. There was no more space for lies or power games. Clara's life, Mariana's life, all the promises made in the past were now at the center of his own redemption. Finally, Edward left the office with a relieved sigh. Outside, the snow was gently falling over Chicago, but his vision of the future was finally clearer. In his heart, he knew it was now over. The fate of the people he loved, Clara, Mariana, even Richard, would be built on truth. The circles they created, with secrets, losses, and desires, were now closing. But somehow, the future seemed like a new beginning. And this, Edward knew, he would live differently. As the lights of the city of Chicago flickered outside, Edward finally caught a glimpse of something that had long seemed lost, the full understanding of his own journey. Everything he had done, all the choices, successes and failures, everything seemed to come together in some strange and visceral way. He had embarked on a journey through the maze of truth, driven by the unpredictable fate that connected him to Mariana, a street child, seemingly insignificant in the grand world he orbited. But he now knew Mariana's impact on his life would never be erased. What he had called luck, that fateful afternoon when she rescued him from the accident, had actually been the first sign that something deeper was revealing itself as he dragged himself toward the truth. But who would have thought that the true transformation wouldn't come through the gigantic revelations about Clara or the secrets contained in Richard's plots? No. The change lay in the details of the journey he undertook alongside Mariana, a child marked by poverty, pain, and struggle, yet displaying rare and complex wisdom. In searching for Mariana's mother, Edward was, in reality, rescuing not only a mother for the girl, but also a part of himself that he had abandoned long ago, his humanity. And as the days passed and he delved deeper into each clue, into every piece of information about Clara and their past, something began to unfold between him and Mariana. It was not simply a relationship of aid, of rescuing someone from the streets. Edward started to look at Mariana not just with eyes of gratitude, but with deep respect. Each word she spoke carried weight. Each gesture of the girl bore a truth even more unsettling than any formal conversation with businessmen and executives. She wouldn't settle for lies or omissions. She was there, a warrior, bringing with her a story and a colossal burden that, over time, Edward began to understand. He'd never realized how much his life, within the walls of success, had distanced him from the real world. For years on end, he had followed a structure of fixed rules that preached appearance as the top priority. But Mariana broke that cycle in a manner as simple as it was painful. She wanted nothing but what was genuine. By asking Edward to find her mother, not caring about the money or material help he offered in good faith, she challenged not only his expectations, but also the values he held most dear in his life: money, success, power. And he saw in that delicate girl the reflection of the choices he hadn't made, the purity of uncorrupted feelings, but also the marks of a cruel world. Over time, their interactions grew beyond a simple relationship between client and beneficiary. Each step in the search became a profound step in understanding who he really was and who Mariana could be to him. They started to understand each other without words, to comprehend the silences, the unspoken pain, the love, and the fear of something that was about to turn the key to their lives. Mariana never settled for being just another marginalized girl. She did not allow her poverty or situation to define her. She was like a broken mirror for Edward, reflecting every part of him that he feared discovering. Her intelligence, her courage, her passion for the truth made Edward question who he really was when everything in his life seemed just a facade. She became not only a trusted friend, but someone with whom he shared previously unthinkable vulnerabilities. A journey of rediscovery that surpassed any conventional or business relationship. As the web of secrets unraveled, Clara's life, the complicated dealings with Richard, and the revelations of a shared past that Edward had never imagined, Edward felt he was approaching something essential, touching his own heart. Mariana's story, though difficult and often dark, came with a slight glimmer of hope. Looking at her, he saw what he could be, what he might have been, and perhaps what he could still become. It was as if, by rescuing Mariana and her mother, he was, in fact, beginning to search for himself. It was Mariana who led him to reflect, to question how his life would be if he had taken another path, a road with fewer financial ambitions and more sincere embraces. Each step of this search was a step forward toward the best version of himself, toward who he truly wanted to be, without the masks he had placed before life. She made him see not only the system's weaknesses, but also the invisible strengths of the people he had neglected for so long. And then, victory came, but not in the way he expected. The reunion with Clara was tense and revealing, with deep traumas exposed, but there was something that transcended the emotional confusion of the moment. There was something profound in Clara's eyes, and Mariana's shy smile that spoke louder than all the words or resentments. After all, Clara's past could not be erased, but Mariana had always been there, as the anchor. When Edward finally brought all the puzzle pieces to light, something shone. The sense that truth never disappears, and that despite all the mistakes committed, there was still room for redemption. In the end, Edward looked at the city around him as the snow continued to fall silently. He no longer felt the shadows that once dominated him, as if they had dissipated under the light of truth, and something new was taking shape within him. There was something magical and powerful in the connection between him and Mariana. She challenged him to grow in a way no one else could, for while he rescued her mother, she was rescuing him from a state of life where he was adrift. Together, they had torn away the curtain of fiction he lived under and given the future a new chance, rooted in learning and faith in people. The future was uncertain, but now Edward had a clear understanding of the steps he should take. He knew that, from that moment on, his life would never be the same. He was no longer imprisoned by the past, but in search of a more authentic journey, guided by the strength Mariana always gave him. Deep down, what he valued most, what he knew he now possessed, was a new family. What do you think? Did Edward truly find redemption by connecting with Mariana? Or is his journey of self-discovery far from over? Rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell to stay updated with all our stories, and check out more thrilling stories by clicking here on the end screen.